Hey everyone, so in this video you can join us as we build this greenhouse, which is about 9 feet by 6 feet, with reused windows and a lot of recycled wood as well.
Hey, I'm Dan, and my mom and I bought some land out in the countryside to build a house. And to help with that, we thought we should have a trailer. So why not renovate a 1949 Spartan manor? So if you want to see how these go, plus some other random DIY stuff, subscribe and follow along. The first step we took in building this greenhouse was to lay out the approximate footprint and then remove all of the grass. That's because we want to have a gravel floor, if you can even call it a floor. And so after removing the grass, Tom put down a layer of sand, followed by some weed block. And then on top of that went the gravel. You can also see that he dug some holes for the locations of the support for the foundation. And I'll get to more of that later. Here it is with most of the gravel in place. And so for these pier block holes, here Tom's using 2 pieces of wood that he cut to match the width and the height of the pier block to more easily see if the hole is the right size. For the depth of these holes, we're aiming so that the wood supported by the pier blocks would be level with the gravel. This takes a lot of work because you have to get the hole to just the right depth, and so we had to remove and replace these pier blocks repeatedly, adding a little bit of sand or subtracting a bit of sand each time to try and make it just the right height and also level as well. Here you can see Tom adding a bit of gravel to the hole so that it brings the level of the pier block up, followed by some sand. I don't know how many times we lifted these pier blocks in and out, but it was a lot. Using level, we can see that's not quite right, so we added some more sand and made it just right. Here we're using a 2x4 to ensure that the pier blocks are all in the correct position and at the right height. This takes a lot of patience, but it's well worth taking the time to make sure you get it right. Here you can see that we have 3 pier blocks all lined up, and the level shows us that we've done a good job. So on this second long side, we started off using a 2x4 to line up the pier blocks again, just as we had done for the first side. But then we realized we should make the actual footprint with the 2x4s so that we can make sure they're lined up perfectly. To make sure that each one of these 2x4s can be resting on the metal support of the pier block, I'm cutting 45-degree angles on each corner. So I need to cut off the inside tabs of these concrete pier blocks on each corner. Now I'm simply securing all of the pieces together and using some additional pieces of 2x4 to help hold the shape as we move it so that it's just not flopping around. The best way to ensure that a big shape like this is square is to measure diagonally across and adjust accordingly. But because I've already put in these diagonal cross pieces, it's not really moving. So I'm having to loosen them off so that we can actually bring this shape into square. With everything squared up, I'm securing these diagonals again. Then that allows us to move it around, knowing that it's going to keep its shape. Now we can use this to finalize the placement of that second set of pier blocks. Once the pier blocks were in their final position, we backfilled the holes, and I could remove those diagonal braces from the foundation because it was held in place by the pier blocks. So my sister had several windows left over from her remodel, and we thought this would be a perfect way to use them up. We decided the longest dimension of the greenhouse by figuring out which 2 windows we wanted to have on that side. And it turned out that these 2 windows side by side were the longest, coming in at about 9 feet. So before we made the opposing side, we wanted to frame this one up and get the final dimensions so we can make the second side to match. For the framing, we're just modifying the plans that we bought on Etsy, and it called for using 4x4 posts in the corners of these wide walls and 2x4s everywhere else. To hold this all together, I'm using these number 9 by 3-inch construction screws, and I'm putting 4 in each 4x4 and 2 when I'm connecting to a 2x4. Here you can see the back wall taking shape. Now I'm putting some 2x4s to support the bottoms of the windows. The windows had a lot of sealant stuck to them from when they were installed in the house, and we were able to remove it all just using a hammer and a scraper. So we didn't mind having some wiggle room in this framing because we always put shims to help secure the windows. And these are in turn supported by some more vertical 2x4 studs. Here in the back, you can see some large pieces of wood at an angle, and we were able to cut these down into 2x4s. This wood had actually just been used to ship all the decking material for my sister's new deck. And it was awesome to be able to cut it in half and use it as 2x4s in this greenhouse. Again, I'm using a tape measure to make sure that this is square. I really should have tried to square this up before I put all these interior pieces, but live and learn. Once we finally have it squared up, I'm just screwing in a really long 2x4 to help keep it in shape. This way, when we move it, we know that it's staying square. Now that we've made the widest wall of the greenhouse, I know the exact dimensions of the opposing wall, which is going to have one large picture window in it. Because this wall is mostly window, I'm reinforcing the top 2x4 with 2 additional 2x4s to make a bit of a header. I think if you were building a house, of course, you would want a much beefier header, but this is just a greenhouse and there's really not going to be that much weight coming down from the roof on here. Now I'm putting in all these small studs to support the horizontal 2x4 that's going to support the window. As you can see, this is a really big window. For all these vertical studs, you may need to worry about the spacing depending on the kind of siding that you're going to use. Originally, we have been talking about using the old decking from my sister's deck remodel to go horizontally across the length of these walls, but in the end, we ended up buying 4x8 sheets of siding. And had we known that from the beginning, we would have spaced these 2x4 studs so that the 4x8 sheeting could land on a stud each time. But as you'll see later, we hadn't planned that from the beginning, so we had to add some additional studs to make sure that the joints in the siding was actually supported from behind. Now we're laying out one of the shorter sides of the greenhouse, and it wasn't looking very big, so here I'm just checking to make sure that that's actually tall enough. Something that we learned in building this was to always work either in inches or feet in inches, but don't switch between the two. For example, I measured that a 4x4 should be cut to 6 feet 9 inches, and I remembered that as 69 inches. So I cut it down, and it was only when I stood it up vertically that I realized my mistake. So here I'm building out one of the shorter side walls, and this as well is going to have one single window in it. Again, we're using the measuring tape to ensure that it's square, and once again, I should have done this before I put in all the internal pieces. Here we're framing out the fourth wall, which is going to have a tall, narrow window, the door, and also a side light made out of plexi-glass. In the Etsy greenhouse plans that we bought, these shorter side walls are framed out entirely in 2x4 studs and are then inserted between the 4x4s of the longer walls. So after all that work, we now have the satisfaction of putting all these walls up. So we're starting with the smaller back wall, and we'll keep it standing upright with the 2x4 leaning against the dirt and secured with a screw or two. Now we're moving in the big back wall, which will have 2 windows in it. As you can see, it's a bit heavy and awkward, and we had to straddle it in order to be able to carry it well. Here we're just lining it up with the 2x4 foundation footprint that we already made, and securing the corners with some screws. Now we're moving in the third wall, which has the large picture window, and lining it up with the foundation. Once again, we're just securing it with a few screws, and it's hard to tell from here, but we're using a post level to ensure that it's going straight up and down. Now we're carrying in the final wall, which will have the door, and unfortunately it was just a hair too wide to fit between those 4x4 posts, despite banging on it. Since that didn't work, we just had to tilt it up and shave off a 1/16 of an inch with a circular saw. Then it slid right in with a bit of hammering. This was incredibly satisfying to put in a few screws and see that we had this structure. Now I'm going around and securing everything together with a lot more of those 3-inch screws. And since all these walls are supporting each other now, I can remove these diagonal braces that kept the sections of the wall square. Soon after we completed the framing, Tom painted it all white, and we took advantage of some contractors being in the house to help move in this huge picture window to the south-facing wall. And the window is simply secured with a few screws through the frame. And look how good that looks. Here Tom is painting all the wood that we're going to use as rafters. Here I'm using a 2x4 to make a template for the rafters, because the rafters will have notches cut out of them so that each side sits flat on the 2x4s of the walls.
So just drew that line straight out from the side and that one from the inside. This part right here was about 1 inch off of the 2x4 wall. So then just drew a straight line across there. And so if we cut this wedge out, this should sit flush across the top of the wall.
So I start cutting out the notches with a circular saw and then finish it off with a hand saw. And testing the fit.
Look, it's like we measured.
And it is so satisfying that it looked perfect. Now we're figuring out how far we want the rafters to overhang. Then I'm using the bubble level to draw vertical lines, so we'll have straight cuts. Testing the template again, and then tracing it out on the rafters to know where to cut. Again, I'm using the circular saw to start each of these notches, and then the hand saw to finish them off. Once we cut out all the rafters, we placed the two on the ends and secured them with some screws, then played with the remaining rafters to figure out the spacing, taking into consideration that they would be supporting these plastic roof panels. And in the end, we decided that we liked the symmetrical look of having 3 complete roof panels with smaller roof panels on either side. I'm using 2 screws on each end to secure these rafters in place.
Yeah, I mean, this is like just infinitely more fun than buying a Costco one.
Because there are now gaps in the wall between these rafters, we're cutting down more of the same material with an angle in it to match the pitch of the roof and placing them in between each set of rafters. Here I'm using the level to make sure that it's going vertically. To add some additional structure to the roof, we decided to add some 2x4s down the middle of the rafters. Here I'm using another 2x4 to help ensure that all these are going in a straight line. Before putting these windows up, we attach these pieces of scrap wood to the frame so that we can push the window up against it while holding the window out to the exact depth that we want. In this case, we left 1.25 inches between that piece of scrap wood and the edge of the 2x4 framing. Here we're lifting the second back window into place and securing it with more screws. Earlier, I was mentioning the suggestion to always talk in inches or inches and feet, but not switch between the two. And here's another example of an error arising because of that. We accidentally had the siding cut a little bit too short at the hardware store. Now we're placing the clear plastic roof panels. If you use these as well, you'll see that they have one side rated for UV exposure, so that's the side facing up. To secure these to the roof, we drilled some holes through the plastic, then used short roofing screws with rubber washers to secure those to the wood. Between each of these panels, there's a long plastic channel that forms a joint. The bottom side you want to put in while you're screwing down the panels. Then you place the top side later, pounding it into place with your hand, or preferably a rubber mallet. Here we're cutting down the last pieces of roof material to width so that they overhang the sides by about 6 inches. These roof panels also come with pieces to help seal the ends, but we didn't install those before water had already gotten inside, so Tom is using a leaf blower to help blow out some of the water. Down at the bottom, you can see that a lot of pollen has gathered, and he's using a couple of Q-tips to clean out each of those channels. Only then does he seal the bottom end of the roof panels. Here we're securing the window that will be next to the door. And because of our measurement error, here we're cutting some pieces of 2x4 to help support the siding. Earlier I mentioned that we would have planned the stud spacing differently had we known we would use this type of siding. So here Tom is putting in some additional 2x4s so that we can support the end of each piece of siding. Here we're adding another 2x4 to help support the hinged side of the door. This is a really cool door that we were able to find secondhand. For each hinge, we're cutting a little notch out of the 2x4.
No, wait, what?
So that when the door is closed, there's not a big gap between it and the frame. Of course, hanging a door is much easier with a few people. With those notches cut out, we can now hang the door. With the door hung, we can now figure out exactly where the next 2x4 has to go. And because I saw that the 2x4 was bowing a bit in the middle and not keeping a consistent gap between that and the side of the door, I cut 3 pieces of 2x4 to put in horizontally to help keep it straight. Of course, we don't want a big gap above the door, so I'm cutting another 2x4 to complete the framing of the door. With the door closed, I'm looking to see where the catch will hit, and thus where I need to put the strike plate. This required a little bit of chiseling, and then a couple screws to hold it in. We weren't able to make any of our old door handles work, so my sister popped to the hardware store and picked up this nice handle. With the door closing nice and flush, I'm now completing the framing by putting in these thin strips of wood so that there's no gap around the perimeter of the door when it's closed. And I'm securing these with some finishing nails. And that's the door. Again, before installing the window, we're putting these in to ensure we put it to the right depth. And we're borrowing this cool suction cup from the contractors to help lift it and hold it in place while we secure it with a few screws. For the side light to the right of the door, we're going to be installing some plexi-glass. So I'm using a router with a rabbiting bit to notch out the 2x4s so that the plexiglass sits in there nicely. Because the router bit is circular, we need to use a chisel and a hammer to square out the corners. Now we're cutting down the plexiglass to size with the table saw. The router left some rough edges, so we're just cleaning it up with some sandpaper before installing the plexiglass window. And here you can see it fitting very nicely. And the plexiglass is held in with the siding. Tom really wanted to maximize window space here, so I'm routering out the 2x4s on either side of this back window, sanding them, and cutting some of the roof material down to the size. And for the triangular space above the door and the opposite wall, we're putting more plexiglass. So I'm using the router again to cut out a notch so that the plexiglass can sit flush with the outer edges of the 2x4s. Now we're using a scrap piece of board to make a template for the plexiglass. Boom. And then cutting out the plexiglass itself. For this next piece, the plexiglass was already small enough so we could draw directly on it, and also for the last piece. Here Tom's keeping the plexiglass in place with some temporary pieces of wood and screws. And now I'm cutting and securing some 2x4s to support the joints in the plexiglass. Of course, so many of these finishing details can be to your personal taste, but we thought part of a 2x4 going across to the windows and the door and helping secure the bottom of the plexiglass would go really well here. Now we're finishing off the trim for the plexiglass windows, which also help hold them in place. And I'm just securing these with some finishing nails. When you're doing this, it's really helpful to pound the nails partway into the board before you put it up into place, so that way you can just hammer them all in once you're ready. All the siding and trim work takes a lot of time. In one way, this kind of siding is really easy to use because you can cover large areas quickly, but on the other hand, it has these vertical grooves in it, which means you really need to pay attention when you're trying to line up different pieces. For the siding that was down low and butting up against the metal supports of the concrete pier blocks, we had to remove a bit of material from the back so that the siding could sit flush. And it's all these final details that I think really bring a project together and make it look good. Here I'm securing a piece of metal flashing above the window to help water roll off the top before covering it with siding. On each corner, we're placing a couple of pieces of wood for trim to help clean them up. And then Tom is patiently putting caulk everywhere to help seal it up and make sure that it's watertight. And of course, caulk is really handy for helping hide any flaws in the woodwork. Here, Tom is cutting up some styrofoam insulation and installing it in the walls. Then he's installing some plywood over that to make a nice clean look inside. And to help keep it nice and clean and protect the wood, he's painting it all white. Here Tom's painting the siding to match the house and taping off around the plexiglass windows. Tom installed some shelving in there with some old decking material and also a piece of secondhand glass. And then he got that bench for the front window on a buy nothing group. And now it's really looking like a greenhouse with all these plants in it. I hope this video has been helpful for you and hope to see you next time. Thanks.